Don Quixote by Cervantes. Cervantes' extraordinarily varied life made him uniquely qualified to write a book like Don Quixote. He had been a member of the household of a great Roman cardinal, a soldier, a captive, a diplomat, a petty government official, a prisoner, and a struggling writer. He was a devout Catholic, but was not unaware of clerical shortcomings and had experienced excommunication. He was a genuine patriot, but contemptuous of nationalistic rhetoric. His masterpiece is a big book in every sense. It runs to at least 700 or 800 pages in most editions. A great array of characters of all classes and conditions crowds this generous canvas, and many stories within stories are told. More importantly, perhaps, it is big in the sense of intellectual and imaginative richness. This is why it has survived, and why succeeding generations of readers and commentators have been able to find evidence within it for a whole variety of conflicting interpretations. If we take the figure of Don Quixote himself, it seems that 17th century readers found him simply laughable, a self-deluded fool. In the 18th century, this perception shifts and he comes to be seen in a softer light, still as mad but likably so. For many 19th and early 20th century readers, influenced by the Romantic movement and its aftermath, he becomes a heroic figure, an incarnation of poetic imagination in his struggle with uncomprehending, prosaic ordinariness of the eternal conflict between the ideal and the real. In the late 20th century, his madness has been interpreted in sociological and psychoanalytic terms. Thus, for example, it represents the crisis of his social class in the early years of the 17th century, or a quest for authentic personal identity through a movement away from the conditioned self, via madness, to a recovery of his true or deeper self. The existence of such an extraordinary number of divergent readings is probably due to something more than the tendency of each age to interpret the artistic productions of earlier periods in the light of its own preoccupations, and is, in fact, much more likely to be rooted in the very special nature of the book itself. In what follows, it is hoped to show that contradiction and paradox are the very stuff out of which it is made, and that Cervantes was a writer who was particularly fascinated by the contradictory, many-sided nature of reality. Cervantes opens and closes the book with clear statements to the effect that its purpose is to ridicule the pretended adventures of knights-errant, those fabulous nonsensical stories, and make them the object of public aversion. So he invents a character who attempts to turn the purely literary world of the most popular escapist fiction of the time, the so-called Books of Chivalry, into real-life experience. This is a world full of handsome knights in glittering armour and beautiful ladies in whose service they engage in all kinds of wondrous quests, doing battle with giants, freeing captive damsels in distress from the hands of evil wizards and enchanters. It's a world of impenetrable forests, secret glades, and mysterious palaces painted in jewel-rich heraldic colors. This rarefied world is obviously quite remote from that of everyday reality, and to underline the fact, he makes his pseudo-knight an elderly, provincial nobody, absurdly tall, dry-skinned and sunken-cheeked. Obsessive reading of chivalric literature and lack of sleep had undermined Don Quixote's reason to the point where he can no longer distinguish between fantasy and reality. It is his vocation, he decides, to restore the lost profession of knight-errantry to its former glory. So he improvises a suit of armour from pieces of cardboard reinforced with iron bars, lays hold of a few rusty weapons hanging in his hallway, and sneaks off early one morning on his decrepit nag to right wrongs, succour the needy, and win eternal renown for himself. A local peasant girl, whom he has ogled a few times but never spoken to, becomes the peerless lady of his thoughts, to whom he will dedicate all his exploits, Dulcinia del Toboso. A neighbour, the fat peasant Sancho Panza, is bamboozled into becoming his squire with the promise of one day becoming the governor of an island, or at the very least a duke. And so, Don Quixote, the personage and the book, come into being. His first adventure is, in a sense, typical of those throughout the book. He approaches prostitutes lounging at the door of an inn and addresses them in ceremonious, archaic Spanish as if they were ladies of the court. They merely laugh at the clanging phantasm who stands before them. He keeps a vigil of arms by the cistern in the inn yard and attacks a carrier who removes what he sees as some rusty junk, Don Quixote's sword and shield, from the rim in order to draw water for his mules. Eventually, the innkeeper, or the lord of the castle in Don Quixote's eyes, decides to humor his strange guest by knighting him in the stables, all the while intoning Latin prayers from his book of investiture, in reality his account book. Don Quixote's first adventure, then, is based on an apparently clear delineation between the real world and the world of literary fantasy, but at another less obvious and more interesting level, it reveals Cervantes' acute awareness that the world of the imagination and the real world interpenetrate each other in such a subtle way that it is actually extremely difficult to distinguish between them. He seems to have been fascinated by the way in which not only different people, but even the same person can inhabit a variety of sometimes antithetical inner and outer worlds. Don Quixote is populated with many characters besides the protagonist who, to different degrees and with more or less self-awareness, imitate literary models of living. Every character in the book is, in some degree, Quixotic or mad, and not only the characters in the book, but also implicitly the reader and the author himself. It is a book which takes a serious look at life through the medium of humor. It explores some fascinating moral territory and implicates the reader in so doing. One way of approaching this is to consider Don Quixote's madness. Mention has been made of the fact that the original readers of the book appear to have found him a purely ludicrous figure, whereas several centuries later, under the influence of Romanticism, the opposite view prevailed and his madness was seen as noble and even tragic. A careful reading of Part 1 reveals that Don Quixote is not just the helpless victim of mental derangement, but someone who, to some extent, chooses to be mad and is therefore morally responsible for his actions. Don Quixote's first adventure, at the inn where he is knighted, is a highly amusing, light-hearted display of wit. Moral judgments seem out of place here, yet very quickly the mood changes, and his next adventure we get the first momentary glimpse of an uglier side to his madness. Here He intervenes to rescue a young shepherd boy from a beating at the hands of his master. But as soon as he leaves, elated by his first success, we learn that the farmer caught the youngster by the arm and tied him again to the tree, where he handled him so unmercifully that scarce any signs of life were left in him. In short, he crept off sobbing and weeping, while his master stayed behind laughing. The moral judgment implicit in the sentence which immediately follows is clear enough, and in this manner was the wrong redressed by the valorous Don Quixote de la Mancha. Don Quixote's madness, then, is neither a static nor a purely humorous phenomenon, but something which changes in the course of the story and is viewed from a variety of perspectives. In part 2, he is shown slowly and almost imperceptibly emerging into sanity, as the reality he has denied and suppressed begins to re-invade his mind. The episode of his descent into the Cave of Montesinos, where he sees some of the ideally young and beautiful protagonists of Carolingian romance now unaccountably subject to the ravages of time, and where Dulcinia sends to him for a loan of 6 reals to pay for a new fustian petticoat, provides an intriguing insight into the ongoing process of recuperation taking place in his unconscious mind. Interestingly, his final total recovery in the last chapter comes when he emerges from a 6-hour sleep, which the maid and niece were afraid had been his last. It is as though he must descend into the very depth of himself in order to resurface in possession of his true identity. In fact, these incidents form part of a whole pattern of ascents and descents running throughout part 2. For the first time, Don Quixote is completely accepted as a real knight-errant, and Sancho at last achieves his ambition to become the governor of an island. Even so, one becomes increasingly melancholic, and the other, overwhelmed by the responsibilities of the office, abandons his governorship and on the way back to the ducal palace falls into a very deep hole in the ground where he has time to reflect on the vanity of his ambitions before eventually being rescued. Don Quixote's recovery of his true identity as Alonso Quixano may indeed be experienced by him as a mysterious act of divine grace, but those around his deathbed seem to be unaware of this. For their own reasons, they cannot face the fact that he is dying, they cannot cope with his new self, they now want him to go on being Don Quixote. They are stricken with grief, yet after all, the niece continued to eat, the housekeeper drank and washed down sorrow, and Sancho Panza made much of himself. For there is a strange charm in the thoughts of a good legacy, or the hopes of an estate, which wondrously removes, or at least alleviates, the sorrow that men would otherwise feel for the death of friends. In conclusion, although romantic critics did indeed overact to certain aspects of Don Quixote, and in the interest of recreating its protagonist in their own image, willfully ignore dimensions that are absolutely central, especially its humor, it nevertheless seems clear that it would be equally erroneous to see it as only a funny book. Don Quixote is a seriously funny book, extremely ambitious in its attempt to circumnavigate all 360 degrees of reality, and humble in its inbuilt recognition that this is impossible. It was written in a period of immense cultural upheaval and uncertainty, and to read it as it asks to be read is to come into contact with a mind whose negotiation of diversity and contradiction of the lifestyle supermarket is exemplary in its humor and wisdom. Cervantes' tale of the deranged gentleman who turns knight-errant, tilts at windmills, and battles with sheep in the service of the lady of his dreams, Dulcinea del Toboso, has fascinated generations of readers and inspired other creative artists such as Flaubert and Picasso. The tall, thin knight and his short, fat squire Sancho Panza have found their way into films, cartoons, and even computer games. Supposedly intended as a parody of the most popular escapist fiction of the day, the Books of Chivalry, this precursor of the modern novel broadened and deepened into a sophisticated comic account of the contradictions of human nature. On his heroic journey, Don Quixote meets characters of every class and condition, from the prostitute Mary Torrance, who is commended for her Christian charity, to the knight of the green coat, who seems to embody some of the constraints of virtue. Cervantes' greatest work can be enjoyed on many levels, all suffused with a subtle irony that reaches out to encompass the reader and does not leave the author outside its circle. Thank you.